So I would like to talk a little bit about FSIS guidance documents. So in addition to the CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations, in addition to the directives that they issue to their staff, FSIS also has a lot of guidance documents for establishments. And I want to talk to you about those and how they might be able to help you with your HACCP plan reassessments and continued development. First of all, I want to talk about how FSIS is our customer. Secondly, that they produce a lot of guidance documents, and I want to talk about where they are, where to find them, and what's in them. And then thirdly, to talk about how to use the guidance documents to keep on top of your HACCP system. So FSIS, Food Safety and Inspection Service of the US Department of Agriculture. So they look after import control, as we've been discussing today. It's how product gets into the country. So we have to think of them as another customer, because if they reject the product, then obviously it goes no further. And they're interested in the products and processes or systems that need to meet their requirements. So, you know, if it's something that they find at the port of entry, then they may reject the product. They may also conduct audits here, as you know, and system audits, including processing establishments, and also find issues. So looking at their specifications and guidance will help us to understand their requirements and what we have to do. They do actually think about some things in a different way to the way we do, and take things much more seriously than apparently we do. The first document is this HACCP guidance document. I've put here a hyperlink. If you go into your notes, you can actually click on that image and get to the link, or I've written the web address underneath. And it is very small writing, but again, if you look at this on your computer screen, you can blow it up to the right size and be able to read it quite easily. So this document, as I say, is their HACCP guidance document. Now, we don't have to implement every aspect exactly as it's done in the US. As we heard this morning, our system is different, but equivalent. But I also want to suggest to you that HACCP is internationally accepted and defined, and the US approach to HACCP is very, very close, very, very similar in words to what we find in Codex. And so, you know, there really aren't too many alternate approaches to some of these things. There are sometimes what we sometimes refer to as regulatory HACCP, rather than scientific or technical HACCP. And, you know, that's defined by history. It becomes part of the system, and we have to consider the customer is always right. So, you know, if this is what the customer wants in their HACCP plan and how they want it controlled, then we need to be doing that. There is also a guidebook for the preparation of HACCP plans. Many of these documents are designed for smaller plants, so they really do try to be helpful and give examples, but at the same time they're not trying to be prescriptive. There's this document called Meat and Poultry Hazards and Control Guide. So they've listed typical hazards and typical controls, and I'll show you some of the examples. And you may not have the same ones as they do, but it's worth looking at what they consider to be a hazard, because if they consider it to be a hazard and you don't, you know, you might have an interesting discussion when if a US auditor comes. They also have some general verification questions. The idea being, here's questions that you might ask yourself about your own plan. And I'd like to suggest to you that when you do your annual review, or even maybe before you do your annual review, you get hold of this document and ask these kind of questions about your own process. You know, doing an annual review of HACCP isn't sitting around the tea table with some of your colleagues and going, oh yeah, everything's going okay, isn't it? And you go, yeah, it's okay, okay, we've done our annual review. You've got to challenge your system. So is there a step? Is this step in the hazard analysis and flow chart? Have you identified any hazards? Can the establishment support that the hazard is not reasonably likely to occur? So if you say it's not likely to occur, how do you justify that? And we know, for example, some establishments choose only to measure 0157 in their beef trim rather than the big 6 STEX. And if you're only doing 0157, what's your justification for that? And I'd suggest you've got to look at it every year and see if that justification still holds. The reason that you wrote in 2012, when the testing for the Big 6 was introduced, won't hold water today. So, you know, you should be looking at those kind of things. And, you know, have you identified all the procedures in your hazard analysis? So these are the kinds of questions that you should be asking. Here's an example of a potential hazards on animal receipt and holding. So they list potential hazards as SRMs, as residues, and like antibiotics and physical sharp objects. And then here are some frequently used controls. Now, for chemicals, I mean, they've listed here residue certification is presented for live animals. Well, I guess that might be, in our sense, that might be what comes in the NVD. Or residue control programs is designed to control the residue. Now, what comes out of the National Residue Survey that gives us confidence about whether this is a hazard likely to occur or not? So these are the things we have to think about. Physical hazards, you know, over the years I've heard and seen of, you know, pieces of wire, you know, I think we all know injection, needles breaking, in some areas of the country, barium sulfate residues under the skin, you know, and are all of those listed in your hazard analysis? So these are the kind of examples that you'll find in these documents, and really worth going through and asking yourself whether you're doing the equivalent or not. They have a document on validation guidance. So the FSAS compliance guideline, HACCP systems validation. And it says here, this document is designed to help you to meet initial validation requirements. And there's that CFR reference again. And okay, so most of you have been running your processes for a very long time, so you're not about to do initial validation. But I thought it was interesting in this document, this note down the bottom. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. The establishment should develop an appropriate data in the first 90 days of implementing whenever there's a new or modified food safety hazard control. So when you've made a change to your process that's supposed to be an improvement, when you've made a change that's, you know, maybe have food safety implications, what have you done to validate that hazards haven't been introduced or that the hazards are under control? And so, you know, in addition to doing an annual reassessment of the whole plan, whenever you're making a significant change, you need to be validating that change. They do provide a HACCP model for beef slaughter, and it may not be very relevant for us because our processing systems are quite different. They do make the point that it needs to be tailored to meet your operation. And it includes some of the steps of HACCP. So Stuart talked about the 7 principles, and those principles also get called steps, but there are 5 steps before the 7 principles. And I've listed them here. They haven't put them all in the document, but I think it's again worth thinking about and documenting. Assembling the HACCP team. Who was on your HACCP team? Does it cover all the skills that it needs to in the operation? It's not just the QA manager. It's not just you getting somebody external to write a plan for you. Who's on that HACCP team? What's your product description, including ingredients and incoming materials? So the wheeze and clips would have been picked up in that part of the analysis. What's the intended use of your product? Doing the flow chart and on-site confirmation of the flow chart. I think it's worth listing that who went through and each year who went through and confirmed that the flow chart is still correct. And it shouldn't be the same person every year that gets the job of doing it. You need fresh eyes. You need questions. As I said before, doing these reviews is a chance to challenge your system. Because if you don't challenge your system, somebody's going to walk in and challenge it for you. And you need to have the answers. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, but just to mention, we discussed this morning, obviously, about manufacturing beef, minimising the risk of STEC in beef, and about sampling. So these are the guidance documents that FSIS produced to their industry about controlling STEC and about testing. Now, our systems will be quite different, but again, I'm mentioning them because I think it's worth a quick look to see if there's something in there that you can learn, something that's worth applying. So my overall advice on this is know what's in your customer's specifications and guidance. So looking at those documents and using the guidance, as well as the guidance that the department has on HACCP requirements for US listed establishments to make sure that you're on the right track. If you see some things that you think are really at odds with what we do, it's worth discussing that with your OPV and ATM, just to make sure that it's something that we're looking after rather than, you don't have, it might be something that we have an equivalence about rather than something that you have to copy exactly what the US have said in their documents. And I really strongly advise that you use those guidance documents when you're conducting an annual review of your HACCP plan. Give your HACCP plan a good challenge by using these documents, and maybe doing that soon rather than waiting until the annual review is due. A couple of weeks out from the auditor arriving isn't the time to review your plan and decide that you need to make some changes. So thank you, and I wish you well with making use of those documents to improve or bulletproof your plans.